A NASA spacecraft with 3 astronauts on board was about to land on the moon, but something terrible happened that no one was prepared for. This spacecraft was at a distance of 322,000 km away from Earth. It took 3 days for them to reach there. The main oxygen tank blasted due to some fault. This oxygen tank was supplying oxygen to the astronauts, and now astronauts were certain about their fate. Now only 15 minutes of oxygen was left in the cabin, and it was impossible to reach Earth within this time. Once again, welcome to Discover TV videos. Viewers, sending only robots to space, in itself, is a difficult thing for NASA, but to send humans and bring them back unscathed is a sophisticated mission where failure is not an option, as failure would mean risking years of hard work and human life. Spacecraft protect astronauts from deadly sun rays, but they also provide an Earth-like atmosphere so that they can remain alive. Pressurized cabins have oxygen tanks installed for oxygen supply, and special filters are there to remove carbon dioxide. If something happens to the spacecraft in space, then the spacecraft and its astronauts will be lost in space forever, and it will not be possible for anyone to bring them back. But you'll be surprised to know that something similar happened to Apollo 13 in April 1970. It is an actual incident that is no less than a science fiction story. 1 year before this mission, Apollo 11 successfully landed on the moon, and Neil Armstrong became the first man to walk on the moon. After Apollo 11, Apollo 12 was also successful, but now, it was the time for Apollo 13, whose mission was to explore the moon further. Apollo 13 was scheduled to land on a big crater, and this portion of the moon is called Morrow. The commander of the mission was James Lovell, and John Swigert and Fred Haise were the 2 module pilots. All 3 astronauts bid adieu to their families and went on the voyage. The rocket was launched on April 11, 1970, from Florida's John F. Kennedy Space Center. As this was not the first trip to the moon, not many people were interested in watching its live broadcast. The spacecraft had 3 parts. This cone-shaped portion was called the command module. All 3 astronauts were going to spend most of their time here. The portion resembling a spider was called the lunar module, and its main purpose was to land on the moon and take the astronauts back. The third and last part was this cylinder, which contained the engine and oxygen tanks, and that's why it was called the heart of the spacecraft. The plan was that the spacecraft, after exiting Earth's orbit, would circle around the moon. During that time, the astronauts sitting in the lunar module would detach it from the spacecraft and land on the moon. After collecting the samples, the lunar module would take them back to the moon's orbit, but they would again align themselves with the spacecraft and head towards Earth. But little did they know what fate had planned for them, something they had never fathomed. It had been 55 hours since they had left Earth. The spacecraft was heading towards the moon, which was at a distance of 322,000 km from Earth. Meanwhile, when an astronaut pushed a button to check the oxygen tank level, suddenly, a strong jerk was felt. This jerk was so strong that the other astronauts sitting in the command module also felt it. At first, everyone thought it was another joke by module pilot Fred Haise, but this time, even Fred was worried and anxious like the other 2 pilots. Before they could think more, the master alarm and electrical power failure light started to blink. It was detected that due to a short circuit, 1 oxygen tank had been completely destroyed. The mission commander briefed the whole situation to Mission Control at NASA. Mission Control at NASA was in chaos after receiving this news because NASA engineers knew the consequences of a blast in an oxygen tank. After a few minutes, when Mission Control received real-time data from the spacecraft, they discovered that not only had 1 oxygen tank been blasted, but the other oxygen tank was steadily emptying. Along with that, 2 out of 3 electrical supplies had also been destroyed, which were the main instruments to drive the spacecraft. Handling all these problems at once was difficult for Mission Control, and meanwhile, Commander James Lovell saw gas leaking from the command module. This was oxygen gas leaking from the second and last oxygen tank. Now, all 3 astronauts knew they were in for a rough ride. Now all the lights were off, and they didn't have water to drink. Only 1 power backup was left, and the oxygen they were breathing in was coming from the last and leaking tank. Apart from these problems, there was another terrifying situation. Due to the blast, the spacecraft's direction had changed, which meant that if they didn't correct their direction, they might get lost in deep space forever. Therefore, they needed to correct their direction first. On the other hand, the news spread all across the globe. The television networks that had been ignoring this mission now started covering the crisis of Apollo 13. Along with the families of the astronauts, the whole world was watching this tragic news. They were running out of time, and it had been 1.5 hours since the blast happened. The last oxygen tank had only 15 minutes of oxygen left for the command module. At this point, NASA's mission control decided that the astronauts must shift from the command module to the lunar module. Fortunately, the lunar module had a separate oxygen supply, but the problem was that it was designed for only 2 astronauts. However, there was no other option, so they had to take this step. All 3 astronauts went inside the lunar module, while NASA engineers were doing real-time calculations to determine how long it would keep them alive. From the calculations, it was found that the lunar module could supply oxygen for 2 days. But the real question was, when and how would these astronauts be brought back to Earth? No one had the answer to this question. To bring Apollo 13 back, NASA had 2 options. The first was to bring the whole spacecraft towards Earth by using the main engine. But since this main engine was running on the last fuel source, engineers feared that the engine might stop midway. The second option was to utilize the moon's gravity to push the spacecraft towards Earth, which would require less power. Although NASA Mission Control chose the second option, it had a problem. After completing a circle around the moon, the spacecraft needed to be pushed by firing the lunar module engine to enter Earth's orbit and leave the moon's orbit behind. The lunar module engine, which was designed to take off from the moon, was now required to do something different, and it was quite risky. The calculations for when and for how long the lunar module engine needed to be turned on were complex. Even a small error in this calculation could result in disaster. Mission Control sent all the calculations to the astronauts, and they did exactly as they were instructed. After completing a rotation, they turned on the rockets at a specific point for 35 seconds, which directed them toward Earth. After 2 days, the spacecraft was near Earth, traveling at a speed of 32,000 kilometers per hour. And now they had to perform a difficult maneuver. Before reaching Earth's atmosphere, they had to leave the lunar module and return to the command module because only the command module was designed for re-entry. Therefore, wearing their spacesuits, they entered the command module, where the temperature had dropped below freezing as all the computers were off. To enter Earth's atmosphere, they separated themselves from the lunar and service modules. NASA's Mission Control and the entire world held their breath because it was time to enter Earth's atmosphere without any control. Soon after entering Earth's atmosphere, they opened their parachute, which was now broadcast live on television, along with the families of the astronauts. Everyone was celebrating. After a total of 5 days, on April 17th, their module dropped into the Pacific Ocean. From there, they were quickly rescued. Hope you will like and share this Discover TV video. My heartfelt appreciation for your loving comments. We'll meet you in another amazing video.